Hello, welcome to Unit 1. Today we're going to be talking about cities and settlements in North America. And that's because there was a incredibly long history of human settlement and habitation in North America that stretches really tens of thousands of years. And so it's important we learn about this history and we understand what sort of civilizations lived here and what they did while they were here. So, I will begin every lecture with goals for the class. And these are the sort of main talking points I want you to be able to to come out of the lecture, and be able to apply in your papers and eventually, hopefully, in your final project as well. So, our goals of the class for today are to understand cities in North America before 1492, before Columbus arrived in Taino land in modern day Hispaniola, modern day Haiti, and Santo Domingo. Next, I want you to be able to explain how population centers in North America functioned, um, what they did, how were they organized, what sort of civilizations were these places. And then lastly, I want you to be able to understand the diversity of lifeways in North America. And when I say lifeways, I mean literally that ways of living, right? Do people primarily live by the ocean, gathering fish and resources from the sea, or do they move a lot and move between different ecoregions, or do they form large civilizations on a river where they grow corn and beans and squash? So we'll talk about a few of these different civilizations. So one way we want to begin is talk about the ancient Western Hemisphere. And what do I mean by this? Well, tens of thousands of years ago, um, much of Europe was covered in an ice sheet. You can see this right here on this image. And you'll notice here lots of things that we consider as having incredibly old historic towns and villages, like for instance northern England or Scotland, or parts of Russia or parts of Scandinavia, were covered in an ice sheet. No one was living there 10,000 years ago, guaranteed. No one could survive on a glacier. Um, but people were living in the Western Hemisphere around the exact same time. So people were living in Cactus Hill, which is close to modern day DC. There's records of human settlements there. People were living in modern day Brazil around 30,000 years ago. People were living in the Mexican River Valley, near Chicote Cave, um, around 25,000 years ago. And this is much earlier than many archaeologists 40, 50 years ago thought that people were living in the Western Hemisphere. People have been living in the Western Hemisphere for at least 20,000 years, probably more. Um, and they didn't just come down through this ice-free corridor across the Bering Strait. They came on ships, probably skirting coast along modern-day Alaska and Russia, and some might have even come from Polynesia. It's hard to say. There's a lot of disagreement among archaeologists about it today. The point being that people have been living in areas that we are currently standing on now for much, much longer than people have ever lived in Northern Europe. So we really have to think about North America as actually an ancient place with and a very old place with lots of incredible history to it. So next I want to talk about linguistic diversity, because this is another thing that tells us that North America is a very old place. So if you go to modern day Europe, um, on average you will meet people who speak Indo-European languages, which are languages all from the same family. So German, French, Spanish, um, even Russian, Swedish. These are all languages that have actually more in common than not. They definitely have different words for different things, and they sometimes have different ways of conjugating verbs and as well different case endings, for instance. Um, but they follow the same sort of word order, right? Subject, verb, object. And this becomes because they're all from the same language family, and they're fairly close languages to each other. This was not the case in North America, and is not the case in North America. Among Native Americans in Western North America, there's incredible linguistic diversity. So again, look at this linguistic diversity map, and you can see the number of different language families. You're talking about Siouan, Athabascan, Algonquin. Each of these different language families are as different from each other as Chinese is from modern-day German. And these people lived in fairly close proximity to each other, often in California, which was one of the most linguistically diverse places in the world, up until it got invaded by the United States in the 1840s, 1850s. And we'll talk about that history later on in this course. But this is another way of saying not only was North America ancient, it was incredibly diverse in terms of different languages, in terms of different cultures, in terms of different peoples who lived throughout the continent. One of the first civilizations I'm going to talk about is that of Poverty Point, which is a site of a ancient city that was built around 3,500 years ago, which would have been around the same times as the Egyptians were building some of their later pyramids. And Poverty Point is located in modern-day northeastern Louisiana, near the Mississippi River. Now, this site was a massive complex that spread over 3 kilometers. And as you can see, this site was a sort of complicated array of different mounds and ridges that were constructed. And these mounds were fairly large. Each of these ridges were several feet tall and stretched for around at least a kilometer. And then they had a few larger mounds as well, which you can see here on the PowerPoint. And these mounds were built very quickly, likely within 3 months, which suggests a mobilized and very organized labor force. And one might look at a mound and be like, okay, it's a bunch of dirt kind of built up right next to each other. But think about how hard of work it is to dig a hole that's simply 6 inches deep, right? Now imagine moving all of that earth and building up mounds that are several feet high. And then imagine doing that for several kilometers. This is a construction project that requires a substantial amount of labor, probably hundreds of people, if not thousands, working every day to build such a site. So this suggests a fairly organized society that could organize such a labor force. So what did people do at this site? Well, this site was a major site for regional trade and commerce, which many archaeologists think was its primary purpose. This was not a religious or ceremonial site. It was a place for people to come around the continent, to come to Poverty Point and trade. And people also think it's a multicultural place of interchange and exchange, which probably actually spread mound building culture throughout the continent to other areas of the modern day Midwest, other parts of the South, and other parts of the Mississippi River. And a large population actually lived on the ridges of Poverty Point. So each of these different ridges, you would have people who built houses on top of these ridges. And Poverty Point wasn't actually a site of agriculture. It was a site mostly of hunting and gathering. So people would live on these ridges and then go out and hunt deer or hunt other game, perhaps fish in the Mississippi River, and bring these goods back to Poverty Point, where people would have their towns and would live. And archaeologists there found tools, decorative objects, and also baked clay balls, which suggests, again, people were regularly playing at a ball court, at this ball court mound here, which, again, suggests a larger settlement. Um, and around 3,100 years ago, this site was abandoned. And overall, the city stood for around 600 years. So it was a major site of human habitation. That is one of the most ancient sites in all of North America. So mound building culture did not just stay in northeastern Louisiana. It actually spread here to the Midwest and here to Ohio. So the Adena mound building culture was one of the most prominent ones around this region. So the Adena people lived between roughly 2,500 and 2,000 years ago. And they built mounds and town sites across a large region stretching from modern day Indiana to West Virginia. And this picture I have here is actually of a mound I saw in West Virginia, just across the border. And it's actually just in a regular neighborhood. And this is one of the most ancient sites in North America, and it still stands today. And you'll see as well, I actually recorded for my video memo for this unit. I recorded a video of Shrum Mound, which is just 5 miles from campus, and I highly recommend you go see it. This is pretty incredible. And in these mounds, the Adena people often left exotic trade goods, and would also often bury their dead along with the sort of remnants of their houses. And other goods. And archaeologists aren't exactly sure about the meaning of why the Adena culture did that, but nonetheless, that's what a lot of these mounds ended up holding. And the Adena people, through the sort of accumulation of exotic trade goods that archaeologists have found in a lot of these mounds, archaeologists think the Adena people had these extensive trade networks across the continent. And the Adena people practiced a mix of hunting and gathering, and also some agriculture at sites, though this varied depending on the site. So again, primarily you're seeing that some of these early mound builders are not agriculturalists, actually. So the next people who lived in Ohio after the Adena culture are called the Hopewell culture. And these were people who lived between roughly 2,000 years and 1,500 years before the present. And unlike the Adena culture, they were mostly concentrated here in Ohio, and they built more extensive mound sites and towns and settlements on the streams and rivers in central Ohio. And most of these mound sites were actually concentrated on the southward flowing rivers throughout the region that then empty into the Ohio River. And here we see sort of a development of the Adena culture, and that the Hopewell culture has even a larger accumulation of exotic trade goods from very far away. And so these were people with extensive trade routes. So, for instance, in some of these mound sites, people have found copper, mica, and marine objects. And the sort of marine objects would only come from the Atlantic Ocean, as far away as South Carolina. Copper would come from the upper Midwest, and mica is actually not even found until you get all the way to like Yellowstone National Park. So you're talking about incredible trade networks here. And the other difference about the Hopewell people is that they did build mounds for ceremonial and religious purposes, and that people came to Hopewell complexes in modern day Ohio, in modern day Chillicothe, and they came as actually often for purposes of a religious pilgrimage. They wanted to see these mound sites for themselves, and they would leave these trade goods from thousands and thousands of miles away as almost an offering for whatever religious deity they were worshiping at the time. And so shows the sort of development of mound building culture from a culture that emphasized these areas for sort of secular trade to a place of actually religious pilgrimage. And I really encourage you all to go down and see the Hopewell complex in Chillicothe. It's quite an incredible site, with around a dozen mounds all around this area, near the Chillicothe River. It's pretty neat. And as well, I want to say the Hopewell complex in Chillicothe, as well as the Newark earthworks, were recently declared to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This is a huge deal, a huge honor. There are very few UNESCO World Heritage Sites throughout the globe. So these are incredible sites of ancient history here in Ohio, that are important to understand, in terms of Native American history. And so these were also sites of mixed hunting and gathering, but also more extensive agriculture at these sites as well, with larger populations as well. The last mound building people I'm going to talk about is that of Cahokia. So Cahokia was the largest pre-colonization settlement north of the Rio Grande. Around 10,000 people in the settlement alone, and then thousands upon thousands of more people outside of the settlement. And unlike the other mound building peoples we talked about, like for instance the Hopewell, the Adena, and Poverty Point, this population was largely sedentary. It was a permanent population that engaged in extensive farming, not hunting and gathering. And the site of Cahokia actually moved through different stages. So it started out as actually a fairly egalitarian communal area, and archaeologists have been able to find this out through by looking at the site of Cahokia and finding that people store their food communally, by villages, and eventually this changes though, and food storage becomes family oriented and actually private. And so what this means is that society overall moves from this sort of egalitarian society into one with actually much more hierarchy in the society. And that's because a local elite class actually takes over the society at Cahokia and becomes a sort of priestly elite that rules over this society quite with a good amount of coercion and a good deal of violence. And they force the local people to engage in these large mound building projects for this priestly class, which often lives on the top of these mounds. And these are also some of the largest mounds in North America. So I encourage you to visit the site if you're ever around modern-day St. Louis, where Cahokia was located. And you'll see these are incredibly huge, huge mounds. But it was this exact movement towards hierarchy that actually possibly leads to Cahokia's downfall. So around 1200 AD, fairly quickly after that, there's a large drought, and the people actually rise in revolt against the local priestly class, and eventually the site's abandoned, and these 10,000 people who are living in this large city, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, disperse. They abandon it, and they go on to establish many other different people groups and civilizations around the modern-day Midwest, that sort of reject this sort of hierarchical type of society, because it didn't work for the average person. The average person actually had a very short and tough life, living in Cahokia, compared to many of these other hunter-gatherer societies where people could be, expect to live to around 40 years old at least. Unlike in Cahokia, where people usually died around 25, 27 and died with malnourishment often. And so Cahokia, for a whole variety of different reasons, is abandoned actually quite quickly within just 200 years of its establishment. So now I want to turn from the mound building peoples and talk a little bit more about the indigenous peoples of the Northeast. So groups of many different peoples, of Algonquin-speaking peoples as well as Iroquoian-speaking peoples, lived in the modern-day Northeast and the Great Lakes region. And these peoples adopted Three Sisters agriculture, which is maize, beans, and squash, which are all grown together for a variety of different reasons, but mainly because each of the plants work together when they're grown together and actually produce pretty great yields. And they also provide great nutrition for the people who grow them. And so the Algonquin peoples and the Iroquoian peoples adopted Three Sisters agriculture around 800 AD up until around 1000 AD, and then into the modern day. And this allowed for the indigenous peoples in the Northeast to have rapidly growing populations around 1000 AD. And a lot of the peoples Native American nations we know today are among these peoples. So, for instance, the Five Nations or the Haudenosaunee, who established a confederacy through the Great Law of Peace in around 800 AD, of which were the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, and the Oneida and Mohawk here in modern-day upstate New York. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Haudenosaunee later because they've become an incredibly important political force in North America. And then there's a lot of other Algonquin peoples as well, like the Powhatan Confederacy, which we will discuss, the Abenaki, the Anishinaabe, and the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, Shawnee. We'll talk all about these different peoples. For now, I want us to talk about the Northeast around Connecticut and Massachusetts. The Algonquin peoples who lived here in the Northeast were the Lenape, the Pequot, the Narragansett, and the Wampanoag. And these were really a group of peoples who were heavily tied to the ocean. And they subsisted on a significant amount of fish from rivers and from the ocean. And they often engaged in fishing far and wide and traveled throughout most of the Northeast coast. And often they would have their villages on the coast during the summer, and then they would move their villages into the interior during the winter to hunt game and to also avoid those strong winter storms in the Northeast along the oceans. And people built some sort of incredible inventions around this time. So, for instance, we know the Narragansett built a actual sailing vessel that they called the Sipakeheg, and it was a large dugout canoe that could carry 20 to 30 people, and had rudimentary sails where they could sail along Long Island Sound. And these large dugout canoes were often made from the trunks of tulip trees, which were then dug out to seat 20, 30 people. They also made birch bark canoes for navigating the narrow rivers, and which they also would store underwater in lakes. And this would actually prevent the rotting, the warping of the wood, and allow people to keep their canoes over the course of the different seasons. And so really we need to think of these peoples as ocean-going peoples. and it's a different sort of life way than those of for instance, the mound building cultures of Cahokia or Hopewell. And lastly, on our quick journey across different Native American societies in North America before 1492, I want to take us further south and take us to the Valley of Mexico and Lake Texcoco, where the Aztec civilization built their capital, Tenochtitlan, which was the largest city in North America in the 1400s, and one of the largest cities in the world in the 1400s. So the Aztec Empire was established in Tenochtitlan by a group of people, the Mexica people, who were kind of a late arrival to the Valley of Mexico and arrived at a place where people had been living for tens of thousands of years, and many different civilizations had grown and developed incredibly complex cosmologies and knowledges and complicated cities around this area. But the Aztec Empire was able to conquer a lot of the peoples in this area and bring the resources of these different people to Tenochtitlan, which was built on this island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. And most of the city was constructed with mostly one-story buildings, but two-story buildings often housed nobles. And waterways and streets were sort of interspersed into this sort of complicated city environment, not really unlike Venice, modern-day Venice. But there was no actual source of fresh water in the town because the lake was often kind of brackish. And so water was often brought in from outside the city through aqueducts and also on canoes. And the city was organized into 4 quarters. Each neighborhood had an individual leader, a temple, and a telpochkali, or school. And there was a temple precinct in Tenochtitlan with around 78 different buildings. And then you had a palace built for each ruler who ruled over not only this massive city of 300,000 people, but also a incredibly large empire that stretched all the way across the Valley of Mexico and even all the way to the Atlantic Ocean as well, if you include dependencies of the Aztec Empire. And you can see on this map here, which is a map that was made in 1524, shortly after the conquering of the Aztec Empire, sort of what a magnificent city this was. It was actually covered in gilded and gold, and you had these causeways that connected the island to the parts of the mainland. And along these different causeways, you would have houses just stacked up right up against each other. And you had a large population in this very, very small area here. So what was it like to live in Tenochtitlan in, say, 1480? Well, there was a wide variety of goods sold throughout the streets and in the different markets all throughout the city. You could walk out the door and find exotic foods, exotic textiles, goods from across the Aztec Empire that were brought into the city. And to make all of this run, you had to have a big service economy. So you had goods that were carried by canoe and by huacali, who were basically delivery workers. And delivery workers made up around of 25% of the population, and these were people who were runners. And they would take goods and put it on their back and deliver it from, the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean all the way to Tenochtitlan and then back again. And this is how people made their living. And so you could order a good from across the empire and have it delivered to your home. This is the sort of medieval version of Amazon delivery. Um, and this was a major section of the economy. But barter exchange was also common. And so people would be exchanging goods in the street. But you also had cacao beans and cloth that were used as money for some of these exchanges as well. In addition, you could work as a construction worker. There was constant building of new houses, new buildings in Tenochtitlan. Of course, if you're housing 300,000 people, it requires a lot of housing. Um, there are also a group of people who are cleaners who regularly clean the streets and cleaned nobles' houses, especially. There are merchants, warehousers, and that large service industry I talked about. And then there were groups who worked to run the Aztec Empire. These were priests, these were administrators, these were scribes. And they all had important jobs within the Aztec Empire. And that's the sort of last part I want to talk about in this lecture is that the Aztec Empire as well was a very coercive empire. So how did they get all these goods and resources? Well, they conquered other peoples and other societies. And they used force to extract tribute from these different societies. And so for the next lecture in Unit 1, we will talk about the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire and also how the Aztec Empire worked and what its relationships were with its neighbors. But I hope this unit has been a sort of a good summary of looking at the different civilizations that existed in North America before 1492. And you can see how people lived in such different ways. You had people subsisting on the ocean in the modern day Northeast. You had the mound building cultures in modern day Ohio. People engaging in religious pilgrimages, moving thousands and thousands of miles to visit some of these mounds. And then you might have seen as well urbanites, living in what we would even consider today a fairly modern city in Tenochtitlan in 1400s. People lived in incredibly different ways in North America. It was a very diverse place of different languages and different civilizations that functioned in very different ways. So it's important to keep that in mind as we move into the other parts of the unit, and we'll talk a little bit more about the coming of Europeans and of Native and European relationships into the 1500s. So thank you very much.